So we're in the United States history book in chapter 21, the second section, and we're talking about the progressive era. And the first progressive president, considered the first progressive president, was Theodore Roosevelt. And we're going to find out he was a quite dynamic president. And we're going to find out some amazing things about this president and his life. And so, and how he becomes president, we're going to talk about what the progressive era was and the business and labor dealings during this time, how they were protecting the public. Actually, he is president, protecting the public and conserving the nation's resources all in one. So here's some pictures of him. You see up here, no one cares how much you know until they know how much you care. But you didn't know that Teddy said that. And on to here it says, we must dare to be great, and we must realize that greatness is the fruit of toil and sacrifice and high courage. Teddy Roosevelt. Some pictures. Here's a picture of his family in the White House, very famous picture. Here's a picture as he is a Rough Rider, a cowboy in the midst. He was a cowboy. And here's a picture as he went he was a student at Harvard University. It says, friends, I shall ask you to be as quiet as possible. I don't know whether you fully understand that I have just been shot, but it takes more than that to kill a bull moose. We'll find out his saying. He was actually shot and bleeding and found out that he was doing okay. So he got up and gave his 84-minute speech before he went to the doctor. So anyway, that's Teddy. You're going to find out. I'm going to give you a list of a lot of things that are just, it's like the crazy true story of Teddy Roosevelt. You're going to find out a lot of different things about him. Roosevelt becomes president. So in 1901, President William McKinley, in the last video we saw, he was just reelected, and in 1901, he was shot on September 14th. And McKinley died on September 14th. He actually was shot on September 7th, I think, and he died on the 14th, like a week later. He was the third president to be assassinated. And it was a deranged anarchist named Leon Schlossgaz. Anyway, Schlossgaz shot McKinley at the Pan American Expedition in Buffalo, New York. So when I say deranged, he was involved in the Communist Party with Karl Marx. He had a lot of, at that time, communism, socialism were coming in. Whether he was alone, they don't know, but now as it comes out that there were probably some other people involved in the midst of the assassination of President McKinley. So they were against his stand on the gold standard and a lot of different things. But we have this Polish guy, Leon Schlossgaz, I think how you say that, Schlossgaz, anyway, going on, at age 42, Vice President Roosevelt took the presidential oath that day. He was the vice president, and now President Theodore Roosevelt would be president. So in the midst of all this, it was not, of course, a vice president coming in. No one planned on Roosevelt ever becoming president. So Theodore Roosevelt was known as Teddy to most, was born in New York City in 1858. He was from a rich family heritage and related blood by marriage to 9 other presidents. I didn't know that. That's a kind of unique fact about him. And every morning growing up, he had heard family devotions. His family, they were Christians, and they had a strong faith in God's word, which he credited as the cause of his success. So basically, he looked at the Bible as very important, as a Christian president would, So it says, a thorough understanding of the Bible is better than a college education, he said. That's one of his sayings. Here you have a picture of Roosevelt here running with McKinley as his vice president. some picture when Roosevelt took over. Here's actually a picture of President Roosevelt. He had taken a flight with the Wright brothers. He was he was the first president to really go onto an airplane. So, Teddy's life. So, some of the things. So I'm going to go over a bunch of things. Some of the things are not on here because I think his life was so unique. In fact, you'll find that they named the teddy bear after him. That's kind of important, huh? Well, the reason is because he basically, in the midst of hunting bears, he found a bear that he didn't want to hunt or kill, and basically bringing in the bears as to be a safe refuge of natural, in the midst of his natural environment. The story was told, and so they named the teddy bear after him. He's also the picture, if you see the statue, I should say, on Mount Rushmore. So you see the presidents. You'll see President Washington, Jefferson, Abraham Lincoln, and then you'll see Teddy Roosevelt, Theodore Roosevelt on there. So he actually was the first celebrity president. As a child, he was at the funeral of Abraham Lincoln, whom he loved, and Abraham Lincoln became one of his favorites, and he read everything he could on Abraham Lincoln as a president, one of his favorite presidents. He was born as a very sickly child because he had asthma, and he was homeschooled, but his father taught him to box, and later he became an athlete. So basically, he was trying, as having asthma, he found that the more athletic he became, the less asthmatic he'd be, you know? So he fought his sickliness into being an athlete. He was a weightlifter. He also did gymnastics, not only boxing, he did jujitsu, I think, and wrestling, other things like that. Well, his father died at the age of 46. His father was a wealthy philanthropist in New York City, and when his father died, his father meant everything to him because his father at that time had, helped him become from this sickly child to a young man, a young adult, and he loved his father. His mother actually came from a Confederate background and his father not. So his father never did fight in the Civil War, which kind of bugged Theodore Roosevelt later on because he was kind of disgraced that he didn't fight. Instead he had paid someone to go into battle, and that really lowered his thoughts about his dad doing that, So anyway, he became involved in politics then, and touring with a photographer in the midst of New York City, the poor. He saw at age 23 what was really going on as the immigrants were coming on and their poverty and everything. He wished to help the poor. He met his wife Alice Lee at Harvard, but a couple years after they were married, she became pregnant, and after her baby was born, her daughter was born, like a couple days after, she died of kidney failure that she didn't even know. So she ended up dying of kidney failure. But the same day, hours apart, Teddy's mother died too of typhoid fever, I think. So it was such a traumatic time and day for Teddy Roosevelt, as that day his mother and his wife died, and it was Valentine's Day. So what happened to Teddy then? He thought he was going to go out and mourn their deaths in some way, and he escaped from his life into the western frontier to be a cowboy. So he thought, well, he left his daughter with his sister. His daughter was a baby, and he said the light had gone out of his life, so he went to the frontier to find himself. Some pictures of him on the frontier in the midst. Here's a picture when he was at Harvard. Here's a picture as his boxing, at Harvard. And this is a picture of him and his first wife who passed away in childbirth. Roosevelt in the West. Well, the West captured his heart. He had a love for the outdoors from then on. He spent so much time in South Dakota in the Badlands. In 1884, he even went, actually, I don't know if he performed, but he went to the Wild West show with the buffalo hunter, Buffalo Bill Cody. And he became this cowboy soldier. He actually became a deputy sheriff and hunted down some criminals. He went and basically was involved with putting forth against the desperados that were coming in, an Indian fighter. Actually, he had pretty much a mixed feeling, an enigma between the Indians, because he's actually loved them, but again, he had like a love-hate relationship with the Indians, knowing whether their savagery onto even loving them. So later on, we'll find out how the Indians really supported Teddy Roosevelt as president. He became friends with many in the West, and he had read much as a child about the West, and he was so excited then about living in the Western frontier. It captured his spirit and tested his American character. He believed in the manifest destiny, but also the preservation of the natural beauty. And later on, he would be a conservationist in the midst of actually opening and preserving a lot for the national parks. He traveled then back to Washington, D.C., and he married his sweetheart from childhood, and her name being Edith Caro. Here's a picture. And they would raise 6 children as they raised his first daughter and 5 children by them. And we'll see later on them running about in the White House. Here's a picture of them in the White House when he as president. Later on, we haven't got to the point where he becomes president, but here we have that picture of them and his children. And basically they came in and took over the White House with all of their animals. The White House became like a zoo full of animals. So let's go on. Theodore exposes corruption. So Roosevelt took the job first, this is before he was president, as police commissioner in New York City. And he found many other that were working in civil services were corrupt. There was Thomas Burns and Tommy Hall, and he basically, as governor, said he was going to find this corruption and get rid of it. He was going to break the corruption bonds in New York City. I mean, that's what he thought he was basically hired to do. So in the midst of all this, he rose to the governor of New York, and he stood up against evil. He fired many, including Thomas Burns, and these guys that were in the midst of civil service there, including firing policemen in the midst of all of this that were corrupt. He followed Jacob Riis, who photographed New York City at night. So he saw all that was going on in the nighttime. So he decided, in the midst of being governor, what does he do? He decides he's going to shut down the saloons on Sundays. So because during the saloons, the drinking and everything, carousing on Sunday, so he thought, so he basically shut down the saloons. And one of his friends says, you need to be careful about the fights you pick, because all of these drinkers and such, they all got mad and were protesting in the midst. But even when they protest, as he went in and talked to them, even on the subjects of them, pretty soon they even supported him in the midst, because Teddy Roosevelt always had a sense of humor, and he always was able to relate to the underdogs, even in shutting down the saloons and bars on Sundays. Can you believe that? Roosevelt politics and war hero. So President McKinley chose Roosevelt as his assistant secretary of the state. This is before he became vice president. And he wanted him to build up the Navy, which he did. In the midst, we'll find anyone that was credited of building up the Navy to make our Navy the way it is now would be Teddy Roosevelt. But he started building up the Navy into a powerful force. And he was very instrumental in the victory of the American-Spanish War that we went on, the Spanish-American War, as you remember. He organized his voluntary army. He basically quit being the secretary and decided he was going to volunteer and put together his Rough Riders, which he put together the cream of the crop, which were athletes and cowboys and Indians, college students, all of these together in one. He even had one guy that was a world champion Ivy League tennis player. So it was very much of a misfit group, as to being his Rough Riders. But at the Battle of San Juan Hill in Cuba, there was a great victory, and they came home heroes. And of course, that Spanish-American War only took a short time, and with great victory, that they all looked to him as a hero. And so then he was chosen to campaign for President McKinley. This is, of course, before McKinley was shot, and but he was chosen to campaign, which he did. He supported in 1900 President McKinley, and then they appointed him to be his running mate, because the reason wasn't that they wanted or thought that Teddy Roosevelt would ever become president, because the Republicans did not want a cowboy to be president. They were thinking, oh dear, but then they knew that President McKinley would win in the midst having a running mate that was such a hero as Teddy Roosevelt was. So they said, we need to put this hero of the Spanish-American War as a running mate, and this would actually, seal the victory for President McKinley. So they did. So Teddy Roosevelt was his vice president. So while McKinley stayed at home, remember McKinley had a wife that was an invalid, and so he stayed at home and did kind of a front porch campaign. Roosevelt traveled 21,000 miles. He was always traveling far, whether he was campaigning for himself or just visiting the country. He actually later on would have his own train that brought him all the way across country. But this time, he was campaigning in the midst as vice president. He traveled 21,000 miles over 24 states, giving many speeches, So, which we find he was a very overactive guy. Surprise, surprise, Teddy Roosevelt becomes president. So the Republican bosses hoped to tuck Roosevelt away in the harmless position as vice president. The vice presidents don't have to do so much, do they, as presidents do? But after McKinley was shot and died, that President Roosevelt now vigorously took up the presidential mantle and became one of America's most influential presidents ever. In fact, like I said, he's on Mount Rushmore with Abraham Lincoln and George Washington and Thomas Jefferson. So a very important president. And after leaving the presidency, Roosevelt remarked, "I don't think any president ever enjoyed himself more than I did." Up until this time, we talked about Presidents Grant and Garfield and all these presidents, and Garfield says, what am I getting into? And Grant's basically going, I'm glad to be out of this. But now we have Teddy Roosevelt saying, I don't think any president ever enjoyed himself as more than I did as being president. And indeed, he did. So, September 14, 1901, he was actually out on top of a mountain, climbing a mountain with his son, when he basically got the message that he was going to be president. You can imagine. This progressive era. So let's talk a little bit about this progressive era. There was a widespread effort to make changes in American political system. That means that at this time, it wasn't the presidents, a lot of the presidents before this time, especially, before the Civil War and even, after, a lot of them wanted to just be able to keep status quo, to keep things together, right? But now there was a widespread effort to make some changes, basically in politics. That's where a lot of things need to be changed. Progressivism opposed corruption, like against corruption in politics, and inefficiency in government. However, progressives often made the mistake of equating government intervention with political progress. That's progress. That's very important because progressives did make a mistake in some way, thinking we need more government. We need to have more government is better. But it wasn't necessarily better. Only basically coming into the point as progressives, especially dealing with corruption and such like that, was important. But not government, if it gets out of hand, it turns into more like communism. So in the midst, progressives there made some mistakes in the midst. We'll find especially gone to Woodrow Wilson with socialism. Well, a type of socialism. But anyway, the progressive movement was adopted at the local, state, and federal levels. That means basically in the states and in the cities and such and all. It influenced both the Republican and Democratic parties. The early progressive leader was Robert L. La Follette. Right here, he lived 1855 to 1925. He was a Wisconsin governor. They called him Fighting Bob. His fight was for good government, to get rid of all of the corruption and inefficiency, and to really bring in morality and positive attitudes. I'm not just positive attitudes, but in the midst of taking away any corruption, that all of the money loss and such as very corrupt politicians. Theodore Roosevelt, the progressive movement, and the square deal. Okay, what's this? Well, the progressive movement is considered to have begun with Teddy Roosevelt in 1901. And then it continued with President Taft and President Wilson. Basically, his start was that all Americans would get a square deal. When you think of square deal, what do you think? Well, a square deal basically would cover it all. Square deal, looking out for your best interests, that you would have a good deal, a square deal, that you would be treated the same, right? That there would be, your interest would be of concern, that everyone would get a square deal. And dealing with business and labor to make sure neither took advantage of the other or advantage of the American people. He praised the building of railroads and the prosperous industry, but he said there was a great concern about some of your business practices. So he basically said, yes, I'm going for you as long as you're doing everything by the law, all right? As long as you're doing everything right and you're giving everyone a good square deal. Just remember, square deal has to do with Teddy Roosevelt. The labor union shall have a square deal, and the corporation shall have a square deal. In addition, all private citizens shall have a square deal. Teddy Roosevelt. He's saying everyone considered and equally and having a square deal. Roosevelt deals with businesses as a trust buster. So when we think trust buster, I always think it's really started with Roosevelt dealing with these big monopolies of business. He was really bold. He was really courageous to stand up to these big businesses that had lots and lots of money, right? In 1902, he ordered his attorney general to file suit against the Northern Securities Company Railroad, charging them with a monopoly as this railroad took over 3 other railroads. So one railroad would take over another railroad, and pretty soon they would have a monopoly and charge whatever they wanted, and they would have control with no business competition, right? So the provisions of the Sherman Antitrust Act, which we talked about, broke up the monopoly. Subsequently, Roosevelt brought charges against 40 other businesses that were doing this, buying up the monopolies, sometimes even, burning down some of their competitors, or, illegally taking them out of business. So, in fact, he even broke up Standard Oil Company. Remember who runs Standard Oil Company? The Rockefellers. He stood up against the Rockefellers. He also stood up to J.P. Morgan in the midst of this railroad heist up here with monopoly. Who was involved but the famous J.P. Morgan banking. He stood up to J.P. Morgan and he stood up to John Rockefeller. And rarely no one else could. But he was president of the United States, right? Roosevelt. In 1903, at his request, Congress passed the Expedition Act, which facilitated antitrust cases in federal courts. So he said, okay, we need to investigate and facilitate, we need to get through. He charged 40 other businesses with monopolies saying, and basically when he did this, it wasn't just because you're a big business, but he wanted to basically say, if the big business do things right, then they will not be charged, but they weren't. He was named the Trust Buster because what they would do is they put together their trusts and become these big monopolies, and he would bust them. But in reality, he did not favor indiscriminately breaking up all trusts. But many of them were good, he said, and efficient, but there was some trusts that needed to be broken up, especially when they took over businesses illegally and monopolized in the midst of charging to the public. Just think, Teddy Roosevelt always represented the public. So it says Teddy Roosevelt in trust busting, while he did support small businesses, he did not truly advocating breaking up all business corporations. He was interested in breaking up the large corporations that broke the law. Basically saying, speak softly and carry a big stick. Well, he did that in the midst of everything, including his trust busting, right? So he's interested in bad trust. Where trust becomes a monopoly, the state has immediate right to interfere. So, trust buster. Government regulation of big business. Roosevelt favored government supervision rather than breaking them up just because of their size. So, Congress adopted several laws to regulate business. So some of these laws here, the Elkins Act of 1903, Elkins Act was it was illegal for a shipper to accept railroad rebates. Basically, when the railroad says, okay, if you ship with me, I'll give you a rebate, lower cost. So they were actually saying illegal for a shipper to do this, to accept it. Hepburn Act of 1906 strengthened the Interstate Commerce Commission, remember, over the railroads. This whole thing has to do with the commerce in between states with the railroads. And he said there should be just and reasonable shipping rates. That's the Hepburn Act. All these had to do with Roosevelt. On to the Department of Commerce and Labor in 1903 established the Bureau of Corporations to investigate the big business. So in the midst here, you have the acts. The Elkins Acts prohibited the railroads from accepting rebates and ensured all customers paid the same rates. Hepburn basically strengthened the ICC, the Interstate Commerce Commission, to give it power to set maximum railroad. So the railroads could not now control, the people, including the farmers and such, and giving whatever rates they wanted to charge. So, Teddy Roosevelt and labor. So, Teddy wanted to see that labor got a square deal. Remember, square deal. Labor got a square deal and business got a square deal. This was pretty much a first. That now he was listening to the labor and saying, okay, something needs to be done in these situations. So in June of 1902, the United Mine Workers, led by John Mitchell, went on strike. The strike went on for months, and many now faced a winter without fuel because the coal miners brought in the coal, and the coal was needed for fuel to heat up your houses. And so now there would be a big problem for a strike to occur, right? And not get coal. So in October, Roosevelt summoned labor and management to the White House for a conference. This is pretty amazing because actually right before this day, I think that a few weeks before, he had got into a carriage accident and fell on his face and had to have surgery on his leg and everything. So here he was sitting in the White House with his leg up, and he said, okay, you guys have to come to the White House. He's wanted to negotiate between the business, the coal miners and the coal business, in the midst, the businessmen. So the owners. So basically, he asked them as Americans to sacrifice personal considerations for the general good. So he said, yes, we have the owners, your mine owners here, these guys coming in, and your businessmen. We have the labor here, the labor union here, and I represent the public. And I'm concerned with the public, so you guys need to negotiate right now. The public needs their coal. So they took the threat seriously and then agreed to arbitrate, but not until it hit the newspapers what had happened. Because Teddy actually recorded what they had said, and as the business, as the owners left, they actually showed this in the newspaper what had happened, and then they had to come back and negotiate again. So it was a great deal. So in the midst, Teddy thought he was lost out when they walked out, but then they had to come back because basically they took the threat. Because basically when I say take the threat, his threat was if they refused to arbitrate, he'd come in as the government and take over the mines. And the mines would go to the government, and they would look at that and think, oh dear, basically taking over the mines from the business. But he could do that in a sense of emergency. So that threat there was important, and Roosevelt demonstrated that he respected the labor interests as long as they obeyed the law. He said, I'll go with the labor unions and everything as long as they obey the law. But if you lash out and cause violence, I will not go with you. He said they would have access to him just as management did. He said he would give them both a square deal in the midst. He said the doors swing open as easily to the wage worker as to the head of the big corporation, and no easier. So, in the midst, the journalists blamed his reforms for a drop in the stock market and the panic of 1907 and that, but no, that's not really in the midst of all that. As he negotiated he negotiated with the big business and then brought the country right back into prosperity. Teddy Roosevelt. So, let me see. I'm going to go ahead and stop there. Protecting the public, we're going to talk about that. We're going to go on with Teddy Roosevelt in the next video.